All right, thank you very much, Council President and council members. So tonight we were going to, usually 6 months into the year we give an update on our strategic plan and the budget, and we'll be doing that later in the meeting. What we thought would be good, thank you, John. What we thought would be good is to talk about an issue that has been discussed at length at the state level, national level. It's been discussed with the council from our prior budget session, as we were adopting, or as you were adopting this budget. And it was to focus on a specific component of the strategic plan, and that was neighborhood revitalization, specifically about distressed and abandoned properties. And this presentation is to kind of give you an update of some of those initiatives, where we are with them, what we've learned, how it has come about in this community, and some of the factors that cause it, because I think that's important to understand how things come about so we can talk about how we can come up with good solutions to help solve those problems. We're also going to talk about a few things that we do well, and then we'll get into some of the tools that we've identified that we think we need to take some initiatives to engage in to try to address this issue. Several things to keep in mind about this presentation. One is this is in the context of a lens of residential properties. So primarily single-family properties, but for the most part all residential properties, not in the context of commercial and residential. The other thing to keep in mind is this issue, as you'll notice as we go through the presentation, didn't develop immediately. It developed over time, which means the solution most likely is going to take time. The last part is there isn't one solution to it. There are several components, multiple components, all feed into a way to address the issue, and how do we put together the right solution to come up with the right answers. So that's kind of a little bit of what we're going to get into. I will tell you, I have talked to several other communities that are having similar problems. We exchange ideas regularly. The staff and I have attended 2 different summits, one actually called the Distressed and Abandoned Property Summit. It was put on by the New York Conference of Mayors and NICOM. Very helpful group. And I've been working with Wade Beltramo, the general counsel there, on some solutions. And I'll get into that a little bit later tonight as how we think we can move forward with some really, I think, first-time steps in New York State. And we may be the first in the door to do some of those things. So real quick, the agenda, we're going to talk a little bit about the causes of property neglect and abandonment. We're going to talk a little bit about our current status of city properties, what we know today. Now, there is a data collection process we've been engaged in, so we don't have all the information, but we have some good understanding of how things are today. Successes to date, tools that we think we can implement here that will solve some solutions or bring some solutions to the table, and recommended actions moving forward. That includes a timeline and some action items. So the broken windows theory. The broken windows theory is interesting. If a window in a building is broken and is left unrepaired, all the rest of the windows will soon be broken. One unrepaired broken window is a signal that no one cares, and so breaking more windows costs nothing. This was actually part of a 1982 article by 2 professors that was focusing on actually community policing, and talked of the difference and compared differences between community policing when you had a foot patrol versus patrolling officers in a vehicle, and the good and the bad that comes with it. How it touched on this was that there was a lack of order maintained without the police presence on foot patrol. And it perpetuated into a cycle using this broken windows theory, as if one broken window would then cause others and cause others and cause others, because there was no order maintained to correct the broken window. It's actually an interesting article. A lot of points talked about it, and from 1982, over 30 years ago, are still relevant today. But I thought it was important to start with that, because this focuses that little issues, if left unattended, lead into bigger problems and contribute to the bigger issues. So, for example, something as simple as graffiti. When we drive in from the east end of town on Main Street, when we hit Liberty Street and we're driving into downtown, what do we see on the left-hand side, just after one of the buildings, before we go into that public parking lot, after City Church, not City Church, but after it, that building? What do we see? We see a big Angry Bird sign, right? The graffiti. What does that say left unattended? It leaves the impression that no one cares. That's a minor issue that we can correct, but it's a minor issue. And left uncorrected creates into bigger issues, okay? So let's talk about the causes of property neglect and abandonment. The term 19th century communities and 21st century is really interesting. I think because when you talk about how this community was developed from a physical perspective, when it was developed, and how that plays into role and how it impacts today. Interestingly enough, your buildings are old. I think we all kind of knew that. The median owner-occupied single family was built in 1939. The median renter-occupied was built in 1952. Compared to the town, it's about a 40-year or a 30-year difference, excuse me, a 30-year difference. That plays a role in the amount of money or cost to maintain a property if it's not well maintained already. It plays a role in modernization of existing properties. When people buy a home, generally they want a modern home or a newer home. That plays a role in that demand of an owner or a potential owner. Transportation has changed a lot. No longer do we need to live where we work. We can drive a half hour, get to Buffalo and Rochester. We can get any retail entity we want in Eastview or Galleria. We could drive an hour, hour and a half to Waterloo, go to the outlets there. We could go to Niagara Falls. So mobility has really become a non-issue. So if I can drive 10 minutes to work, I can drive 10 minutes to get a house that's 40 years younger or 30 years younger than the house that I could get here. Mobility plays a role in this. And there really is nobody to blame for this. I don't want to point any fingers at anybody saying that's the person to blame. This is just evolution. And competing against greenfield developments. Now that doesn't mean a greenfield development in outside the city is bad. It doesn't mean that at all, but it is interesting because newer owners want newer or more modernistic homes. I own a house that was built before 1940. The closets in the bedrooms are 2 foot by 4 foot. That can fit about one of my suits in it without it hitting the sides, all right? Times have changed. Bigger closet space is one small element of that. So it creates an interesting comparative. It creates a we are in a hyper-competitive environment in which we have a competitive disadvantage. Now, I'm going to get into that a little bit more, what that competitive disadvantage means. And some of you are probably saying, I really don't care, so it really isn't relevant. I think it's important to understand the causes of what we're dealing with first before we can understand the solutions to it. So let's talk about supply and demand. Patty said that economics was her strong suit in college, so we're going to talk about Economics 101, supply and demand. The law of supply and demand defines the effect of the availability of a particular product, in this case, the housing market, and a desire or home ownership for that product has on price. Generally, if there is a low supply and high demand, the price is high. In contrast, the greater the supply and the lower the demand, the lower the price will be. High demand, low supply, high price. High supply, low demand, low price, right? Okay. What do we know? We know that population has declined in the city of Batavia since 1960. That's a factual piece of information from the census. We've declined about 15,000 people, 15%, excuse me, 2,700 people or so. Okay, what happens when people leave? They generally don't take their properties with them. They stay here. So let's talk about the supply component of it. Supply, housing stock. Since 1970, you've had a slight increase in housing stock. So for discussion purposes, we'll just leave it as flat. Your supply has stayed the same, but your demand, the amount of people that need housing, has declined. So remember, demand is high, supply is low, price is high. Demand is low, supply is high, price is low. What does that mean from a supply and demand perspective? Whoops. I'm sorry. Okay. Ooh, looks like something has skipped here. I apologize for that. Well, so let me talk about this in this context. So forget about this for a second. This is your supply line right here, okay? Your housing stock based in 1965, this is your supply mark right here. At 2,200 houses. This is conceptual. This is not actual data from the city of Batavia. I apologize. I had a different slide here. Something must have got mixed up. This right here is your demand slide, this blue one. So for example, if the demand is high and there's a lot of supply, price is low. If demand is high but there's a low supply, price is high. So where the supply and demand intersect is what we call as your peak price for housing stock. So if you look at this line for demand and this line for supply, that is the price that is determined by supply and demand. It's at $80,000. If you take what we just talked about in terms of population decline, this is your new demand right here, the green line, okay? So if the green line is your new demand has dropped, but your supply has stayed the same. What does that mean? That means that your price has dropped. Your supply hasn't changed, but your demand for that same supply is less. So hence, the value now shifts from here to here. Okay? So that creates a little bit of an issue. Your supply hasn't changed. We've confirmed that based on that last slide. Your population's declined, so your price technically drops. So has that really happened? Now that's a snapshot in a vacuum of supply and demand, just so we understand that conceptually. Has that really happened? Well, technically it hasn't basically happened in that context, as black and white as that. But what has happened is your stock, your supply stock, has declined. And as a result, people are not willing to pay as much for it, so hence the value has declined. Okay? So what's the solution to it? Hopefully this next series of slides will work. The solution technically would be eliminate, well, two solutions could happen. One is you could bring this demand line up again, right, to here, or you could bring the supply line down to here, right? So obviously we'd love to have another 2,000, 3,000 people come back in the city and improve the demand, increase the demand of housing stock. Realtors would probably love it. People would be demanding houses. Prices would go up. The truth is that's probably not practical. But could we eliminate supply? Is that the answer? We could just eliminate the 400 extra houses here, and it could bring this number back from here to here. Is that the answer? Well, I don't know if that's exactly the answer you want. All right, because this is a community that had a lot of demolition in a residential area. It's probably not what we want, but it's probably part of a solution. It's probably one small component to it. So the point of understanding supply and demand is because it's what's happened. And I'm going to go back to this for 1 second. This shift right here, this is your original demand and your supply, and this is your new demand. This shift right here, code enforcement can't fix that. Code enforcement isn't going to code enforce its way back to here. This is an actual demand. This is how many people want houses, how many people want to buy houses. So I think it's important to understand that shift. Okay, so understanding the competitive disadvantage. I talked about competitive disadvantage. These are all parts that play a role in the competitive disadvantage. The loss of population. Just like we talked about with the loss of population, what else goes when people leave? They lose their buying power. So there's no more buying power from those families. We did a study a few years ago from the Community Improvement Plan. And that plan said that it's an estimated for every four-person family, there's $20,000 worth of buying power that they bring to the table. So when you lose population, you use buying power, retail buying power, groceries, gas, home goods, clothing. When you lose businesses, they again don't take their properties with them. The real estate speculation. What we also found out is the majority of people are not paying as much for housing as some of the competing communities are. Why? Because there's a speculation that if I'm not going to get my return out of my investment. That's a speculation. Poverty plays a role in it. There isn't the resources. Aging population can be restrictions on income. Rental properties as well. Other restrictions. Flood insurance. If you're paying $1,500 in flood insurance, it's $1,500 you're not investing in your property. That's important to consider. So we've talked about, I think, good understanding of some of the causes of those things. You know, there's been a lot of research from different entities that talk about what is the impact. You know, we think that it has a drain on municipal resources. We think it impacts property values around us. Here are two quotes from two agencies and entities that do a lot of work in abandoned and vacant properties. Foreclosures often result in long periods of vacancy, visible signs of neglect, reducing the value of neighboring properties. We think that's true, but there's a lot of research that also confirms it. The other one talks about strain on municipal resources and the impact of quality of life. So let's talk about the current status of our city properties. And I'll preface it with, we've done some data collection. We have more to do, but we have some results to talk about tonight. So one thing is when we look at data and we look at abandoned and vacant properties, we say, all right, here's some data that we're collecting. One is, are the taxes current? We actually rate them from 0 to 4 now, so we were able to determine what's the occupiability. That's not really a word, but I created it for this instance. Meaning, can you move in right away without improvements? It's abandoned, it's a vacant, but it's really not in bad condition. We can move in now with marginal exterior improvements as a 4 versus a 0, which is it needs to be demolished. A 1 is it can't be moved in right away and it needs substantial improvements, and then 0 to 4. And that's important to understand when we start talking about priorities, where our priorities are. Which is real estate owned? REO meaning how many is owned by the bank or how many of them are owned by the bank versus have owners that they're just not occupied. There are abandoned and vacant properties that are owned by owners that we know who they are. It's not leased, it's not rented for whatever reason. They're doing improvements and they've held off on those improvements and it sits vacant. Water usage, believe it or not, the best way to determine how long a property's been vacant, other than the individual telling you they left, is that when they stop living there, they generally don't turn on the water anymore. So we can track that because everybody gets a water bill. So we know when a property is vacant, usually within a 3-month period of time, because they're no longer using any water. Number of police, fire, and code calls. It's important to understand how many resources are going to these vacant homes. How much money are we spending on them? Outstanding fines and fees, that has to do with if we have to have a property maintained or cleaned or grass cut, and change in assessed value over time. That's pretty self-explanatory. So this is what we know right now. Right now we know that we have about 53 abandoned or vacant properties that appear to be abandoned or vacant, all right, roughly. The average vacancy per property is 3.5 years, and that again is determined by the water usage. No water and sewer charges, obviously, during the vacant period. Most are current on their taxes. Now this is part of the reason why we developed this information, because this is a little different than what people typically think when they think of an abandoned or vacant home. Why and how can they be current on their taxes? In fact, only 9 are currently in the city tax foreclosure process. That's about 17%. And it really feeds into the next issue. The next issue right here is the biggest problem and hurdle we have to get over. Banks continue, or lending institutions continue to pay the taxes but do not take title to the property. So this poses a problem for us in several areas. One, if they're not the title holder, technically they're not responsible for the property. So we have a hard time getting them to be compliant or gaining compliance if there's a property code violation. Two, there's no interest in investing into it. They're just paying the taxes for a variety of reasons. So we have to dig into that issue further, and that's one of the things we have to do in the upcoming months, is really understand, A, who are all the lending institutions, and why are they not moving on title? Is it purposeful? Is it because the process is too cumbersome? And the city attorney and I have spent some time with other municipalities. A lot of times what we find out is they're in such large lumps of mortgages, they have no idea that they own these properties. Or there's every property has a unique difference and has to go to 3 different departments in their institution that's in 5 different states. Okay? So we have to get a good understanding on that, because everything we're going to talk about really hinges on moving title of these properties. The average number of annual code visits per property is greater than 5 a year. That means our code officers are going there 5 times a year minimum, and we at least get 1 police call in each property on average. So what does this mean? What does it mean, annual impact? And again, this is estimated. You're losing about $25,000 of delinquent city, county, and school taxes. That's about $5,200 a year in city taxes. Annually, you're losing about $20,000 of water and sewer revenue. Keep in mind, when people aren't in the house, they're not using it anymore. And what I did is I took the average consumption per quarter, took half of that and half the property. So it's a rough estimate. I don't maximize it, but the point is the rest of us water users are making up for that. About $8,000 worth of code enforcement time is spent visiting those properties and citing them. That doesn't include court time, if there is court time. $1,200 in police time going to those properties, $1,100 in unpaid fines and fees. That is, for example, we go to the property, it has to be cited, it has to have another company come and cut the lawn, clean up the debris. They then get a fine and they get a fee, and that's an associated on it. The bottom one is kind of interesting, and this was a real lowball number. If I took $20,000 of buying power times 50 properties, it would be well over $1 million. I cut it in half and said $10,000 of buying power for 50 properties. That's what you're losing in retail buying power. The key there is no residents equals no buying power. That's money they're not spending here buying groceries, gas, clothing, food, home goods, those types of things. The last statistic is really interesting, and it's interesting for 2 reasons. In 2009 to 2014, your average assessed value for a single-family home in the citywide, it only increased 1.8%, while the average vacant and abandoned property decreased 5.1%. So most people draw their attention to this number, okay, decreased in value. That's not a lot of money at the end of the day. It's a concern, and it's a trend you don't want to see. The bigger issue I have is how come your single-family homes only increased 0.3% per year over a 5-year period? A gentleman earlier spoke, he wants to see property values increase. That growth is very slow, very low. Probably has to do with the recovery of the real estate market. Probably also has to do with the lack of demand. Less properties being sold, they're not being sold for as much. So I think that's a bigger concern than this one, but they're both concerning. So what does it mean to us? Okay, data demonstrates that there's a direct loss. We're using services that we don't want to use or that we can't use someplace else. Remember, if our code officers are going to those houses, they're not going someplace else, right? If our police officers are going to those houses, they're not going someplace else. We're losing water sewer revenue, but do they impact the surrounding properties? I think they do. Everybody says they do. We've had a lot of studies that say they do. So here's an interesting study that took place, even though it was in 2001 in Philadelphia, they did a study about abandoned properties in a certain parameter or a radius around them. And they saw that properties within, the closer they were to abandoned properties, their market value was less than the ones that were further away. That's pretty compelling numbers when you look at the differences there. But it's in 2001, it's in Philadelphia. So all right, that's not really relevant to us, right? So instead we looked at, Jamestown did a study in 2010, and they found something very similar. Properties that were near a poorer building or a building that's in poor condition sold for half the cost of ones that were outside a 300-foot perimeter. Half. That's a $25,000 difference. That's Jamestown in 2010 or 11. That's relevant to us. Jamestown is just down the road for us compared to Philadelphia, right? So it does impact it. I don't have the specific market data. I'm sure we could, but I think this does enough to justify that those things that we talked about on the last slide does impact the value of homes moving forward. And that just basically says houses within close proximity of vacant and abandoned properties experience a net loss in value. So now that I think we've done a decent job in outlining some of the causes and some of the effects, let's talk about a few things first, and that's understanding what we're doing that we think has a positive effect on things, and then we'll get into some things that we aren't doing that we think we probably could do. The first thing we're going to talk about is our systematic code enforcement. Now, over the past 4 years, we've taken a very aggressive approach with code enforcement. The systematic and code enforcement program has to do with our code officers going out into a quadrant of the city. It's split into 4 in January, February of every year, and looking at external property maintenance violations. And they issue those violations in January, February. And the reason they issue them in January, February is because it gives the property owner time to gather resources, line up contractors, and be ready to roll from May, June, July when the construction season opens. Versus if you get a violation to paint your house in July, what's the likelihood you're going to get a painter before the end of the year? It's going to be challenging. So we do it in the beginning of the year to give time to prep. And what you've seen is, I think the interesting statistic here is this line right here. The average time it took to bring properties into compliance in 2010 was 8.1 months. In 2013, it was 6.1 months. So what is that saying? That's saying that accountability is happening, the code officers are following up and following through, and you're getting quicker compliance from residents and property owners, I should say. That's important. That's showing that you're showing some success. The other thing that's kind of interesting here is the number of properties referred to city court for further action. 30 in 2010, 18 in 2013, and the number of court case compliance was 17 months versus 11. I think that's interesting too because it kind of says the same thing. It says, A, we're getting quicker compliance, people are being more compliant. It also means we're able to partner with our city courts to understand that there's an issue and you're getting compliance out of it. Those are some decent statistics to look at to show the program is working. This plays into the bigger picture. It is a small piece to it. Roadway surfaces. Some people are probably asking, what does roadway surfaces resurfacing have to do with abandoned properties? Well, I think it fits into the bigger picture. And if you stay with me for a second, I'll show you how. A few years ago, we made the commitment to do a lot of road resurfacing. In fact, since 2010, you've done $5.3 million. And the way we measure it in our strategic plan is every street is rated from 0 to 100%, like it was at school. 100 is good, 0 is not good. And we said passing, or the acceptable level we wanted, was an 85%, what we call a pavement condition index, a PCI. And what we've been able to do from last year and this year is we've been able to exceed that PCI. And I think a lot of people have noticed we've done a lot of road work, a lot of resurfacing. Get a lot of comments from the public, very happy about that. So that's an initiative that we need to continue to do. Sidewalk improvements play a role in that. Okay, we've done a lot of sidewalk work, a lot over the past. Just to give you an example, since 2011, you probably do on average about $200,000 a year. If you go back into a few years prior to that, you were doing $20,000 a year. A lot of work. And I will say that today we just got a big boost. Today the governor's office announced that the city's going to get $720,000 grant to do sidewalks in the city of Batavia. So we're going to end up doing, with our match, about $1 million worth of sidewalks over the next few years. That's going to take a big hit out of that quantity right there, that number right there that's left to do. None of it in the 6th Ward, too. No, it is. It actually goes, I think, from UMMC down Summit and Liberty. I think I have the map on the back of the press release. So that's a good win for us. We did good with that. Vibrant Batavia and community outreach. We talked a little bit about it earlier, Centennial Celebration. What does this do? You know, this is kind of one of those non-brick and mortar aspects of what I call improving the social fabric of neighborhoods. One of the things that broken window theory talked about is that when you had a neighborhood or an area that was communicating regularly, not only with the police department, but with each other, it created an environment that non-desirables didn't want to go because it was most likely that they would be interrupted in what they were doing, which usually wasn't good things. And it created a bond in an area. And that helps build a social fabric. So when you have neighbors communicating with each other, it's a value. It's a value. And this is just some of the initiatives they're working on. The Centennial Celebration is going to be a big celebration. It should be a uniting year, bringing the community together. So the last thing to talk about with successes, and I'll start talking about how they all relate, is our efforts towards housing quality. And housing quality, I think, is important. We have a great relationship with Habitat for Humanities. We've been able to dispose or transfer properties, 1 or 2 a year to them. They do a great turnaround. They basically reconstruct the property. They put a great owner-occupier in it. It's usually a deserving family, and the value of the property goes through the roof when we're done. And it's great. The only challenge we have is only 1 a year. You know, we wish we could do more. The housing grant, 2011, we got a $400,000 housing grant, improved 19 properties. We got another one this year. We hope to do around the same. And the CRS program, which is the flood insurance issue. We're participating in the CRS. We've been making some real good headway with our CRS program, and hope by next spring we'll have a lower rating to bring some relief to our flood insurance payers. So what does all that have to do with abandoned and vacant properties? Well, if you look at when someone's going to invest on a street, are they going to want to invest on a street where the rest of the properties are not maintained and there's no property maintenance? Are they going to want to invest on a street that has potholes? Are they going to want to invest on a street that has sidewalks that are turned up? Are they going to want to invest on a street that the neighbors don't talk to each other? And are they going to want to invest on a street where they got to pay another $1,500 for flood insurance? Who wants to invest there? They don't. That's why those little issues that we just talked about, each one of those categories plays into the bigger role of improving the market value of the homes. Actually, an abandoned and vacant home is the tail of this issue. You know, you've got all those things in line and you're making efforts to improving those things, that is going to feed into solving the bigger solution. So we have to continue those successes. Those are important. They're very important to community development. So now that we've talked about those and how that feeds into the bigger picture and how all those elements come together, here are some tools to address the abandoned and vacant portions of it. I'm going to go through. This issue is going to be a big challenge, and this issue is a challenge, but I think they're important and they're worth discussing and trying to move forward. Inventory. Oh, my solution picture is basically just to show you that there isn't one solution. Kind of like the demolition picture. Demolition isn't the solution solely, but there's multiple solutions to it. Inventory of properties. Okay. So the inventory of properties. Creating an inventory is good for us to understand the circumstances, understand the situation, and be able to make good decisions based off of the information that we have. Several things we can do is understand who holds the mortgages and how do we then combat that issue. How do we get the banks in the room to say, listen, you've got to move title, or why is title not being moved on these properties, so that they can be released and transferred. The other thing it does is, one thing we've talked about, is how do we improve our information that we have on these properties. Something that's very valuable are the residents around those properties that we haven't really talked too much. You know, most of the time the residents that live next to or around the abandoned and vacant properties have more information than we do. They know who the little father-in-law was, the mother-in-law, who the niece and nephew are. They know where they are. They followed their Facebook page and they know where they're working, and oh, we just so happen to have a warrant out for them so we can pick them up and bring them in and get this issue dealt with. Those types of things are very labor intensive, but they help build the situation. And if we can take care of 5 properties that way, that's 10% of your inventory of abandoned and vacant homes. So building that inventory is important. Enforcing the property maintenance laws. We talked about the code enforcement program. I didn't talk about the fire department's multifamily inspection program, but that's something we need to continue. That's inspecting the common areas of multifamily homes once every 3 years. The other things we need to do, when I talked about the graffiti, we need to address little things like that. So in November, we're going to have 2 amendments to 2 sections of the code, one on junk cars and one to graffiti. Little issues, but left unaddressed, present the perception that no one cares. And you'd be surprised how many times we deal with junk cars. The way that our current code is written, it's very antiquated, and it doesn't allow us to rectify the issue. It allows it to, to perpetuate and continue to be a problem. But on an annual basis, continue to review those local laws and make the changes that are necessary. I think it was in 2009 where we did the grass, weeds, and debris change. Do you remember that? I think Rosemary and Kathy, you were the ones on council then. And that really allowed us the teeth to say you got 48 hours to clean up that issue. And otherwise, it's going to be cleaned up. Major compliance with that. A really, really good move. So we got to make good moves like that and review the code on a regular basis. Develop the comprehensive plan. This will take another larger look at some of the zoning laws. Are there some changes to the zoning laws that we want that are going to help precipitate a type of development that we need to see in our area? So developing this comprehensive plan, a very lengthy process. The other component of this is the community engagement of it, which is important. Again, it's the pride the community has in seeing where the community is going to go over the next several years and how you're going to get there. That's an important part of this comprehensive planning process. Taking title of property, this is going to get a little challenging because this right here, this Real Property Action Proceedings Law is challenging. We call it the RPA-PL. But essentially, when we take title to property, one thing we need to continue to do is to continue our foreclosure process. We have it very systematic. We do it religiously, so to speak, on an annual basis. We foreclose on the delinquent properties, and we take title to it. It's important we do that. Believe it or not every community does that consistently. They just don't do it. We do because it helps move the circulation of the properties, and it holds people accountable. Consider using the RPA, or the Real Property Action Proceeding Law, Article 19A. Now, the city attorney and I have done a decent amount of research on RPA-PL. RPA-PL is another process for taking title to a property. It is not the foreclosure process. Its intent was created that when you have a squatter situation, where the property has been vacant and you have a squatter, you can exercise this section of the law and be able to take title to the property essentially in lieu of the foreclosure process or before the foreclosure process. Unfortunately, when I get to it, there's some hiccups in that process that make it somewhat challenging. The other thing we should do is we should talk about developing an evaluation process of how we dispose of properties. If we take title to them, do we need to demo them? Do we need to do an RFP for redevelopment? Do we need to talk about public auction or other? Or do we transfer it to Habitat? And there are pros and cons with each one of those categories. So I'm going to go through those last 2 bullet points real brief to kind of talk about the good and the bad with each of them, if that's all right. RPA-PL. RPA-PL provides the ability to take title to abandoned residential properties. But as you can see, there's a little bit of a tedious process to do it. In order to have an official finding, you have to go through, you have to determine if the dwelling is abandoned. And to do so, it has to be both one, meaning the owner fails to collect rent or institute proceedings for a period of 3 consecutive months, and the dwelling is dangerous to life, health, and safety because the owner's failure to maintain the dwelling. A vacant dwelling is abandoned if the structure is not sealed or basically locked up, or the structure is sealed and either it has to be vacant, currently prohibits occupancy, or the property tax has been unpaid for a year. So there's a bunch of these steps, and don't worry if you don't understand it, because it actually takes to read it several times to kind of get the and the or and the either together. The point is in addition to this tedious process, there's a very cumbersome notice procedure that goes out. So when we foreclose on property or we're going through the foreclosure process, there's certain notice procedures that have to happen for any interested party prior to judgment being declared where we get title to it. This has an even more cumbersome process, which really makes it somewhat prohibitive in our instance. Now, George and I have talked with, well, I know at least the city of Rochester, Binghamton, Utica, several communities that have tried to implement this process. And they have done it with very, very limited success, but a lot of energy and resources towards it. The law is written such that it's very difficult because it's really due process. It's protecting the homeowner's right to its property. So while it's an option we have, it is probably not likely, unless under very specific circumstances, that we would exercise it. But there is the option to do it. It has to be a certain set of circumstances to do it. So once the city has title, what do we do with these options? And I'm not going to go through each of the pros and cons, but demolition, for example, brings certain pros to it. It eliminates the supply, which what we're talking about, that whole supply and demand thing. It eliminates the burden. No longer municipal resources have to go to that property. But it costs money to do it, to abate the property, which most of these properties have to be abated first because they probably have some level of contaminants in them, asbestos, et cetera. You have a vacant lot. What do you do with it then? You know, so that's a pro and a con. Public auction, we can dispose of it quickly. We usually get market value because the auction controls that. And it's back on the tax rolls, which everybody likes to hear. The problem is you have no control over what it's being used for. So it could be auctioned, very low price. It could be then turned over and still maintained at a low quality, low rent or low income coming from it, and you haven't really addressed your issue. Request for proposal. This allows you maximum control, I would say, in all these instances over what happens with the property. Although it takes resources to manage that process, and the turnaround time can be limited or controlled and can take longer. The other is habitat. Obviously, they have a good track record. They have very good success rate. They have limited resources just like everybody else. They can only do one or so houses a year. So those are 4 different options. And I think what we're suggesting is we actually refine this evaluation process. And we take into consideration all of these when we talk about what should we do with surplusing property. Develop a better procedure for this that outlines what you want to intend to achieve. What's your objective of doing an RFP for a residential property? And 2, demolition, it really needs to have a discussion on a selective demolition process. Because I can guarantee you, you're going to have a property that will be in poor condition, take a lot of money to rehab, and you're going to demolish it. And there's going to be somebody sitting in the back of the room that's going to say, I'll take it for $1. You know what's going to happen? I'll put it back on the tax rolls, right? And everybody wants to hear that. It kind of goes against the grain a little bit. But the question is what are they going to do with it? How are you going to control that process? Or are they just going to take it for $1, put marginal amount of money into it, and continue to have a poor housing supply? So those discussions have to happen when you talk about demolition as a possible action. But I think there's a way of refining this so that there's a good evaluation process so the council can make that determination. Another thing, I think a tool you have in our tool belt, which is what we've talked about, is our CDBG grants. We continue to apply. We continue to get good funding. Partnering with Vibrant Batavia on the Home Expo. The Home Expo is something that's kind of come out of the woodwork and actually came about through a conversation I had with a local lender. And she told me, Jason, there's all these resources available. There's first-time homeowner options. There's home improvement grants. There's home improvement loans. There's energy efficiency grants. There's all these things, but nobody knows where they all are because they're scattered amongst different resources and different agencies. Well, what this local lender got together with Leanna and myself, and Vibrant Batavia is going to organize what we're going to call a Home Expo. We're going to get these different agencies together in one location, and we're going to invite the public to say, here are all the resources you have. National Grid is one of those as well. There's home rebates options. All these other agencies, get them together, and then we're going to take that information after that expo and put it on the website for a central location so people know where to access it. You know, that ties into the home ownership piece. That ties into the home improvement piece. And I think a lot of people just don't know what options there are available. City infrastructure, we need to continue to do that. And I think another thing that's going to start adding on to just your roads, sidewalks, and water and sewer is the interest now with pedestrian modes of travel. You know, bike trails. Those types of things are starting to pick up. We just got a grant with the town where you're going to see that cut through the city. That's going to start to play effect in that, which I think is important. That's a quality of life issue. You want to expand the habitat relationship? How can we help them, or how can they help themselves be able to take on 2 or 3 properties a year versus just 1? Improve our CRS rating. That's going to be part of our initiatives over the next several years. How do we bring that rating down from a 10 to a 9 to an 8 and so on and so forth to start giving some real financial relief to our property owners on the south side? And then evaluate a strategic demolition of some of the residential properties. When is it appropriate to demo and why? So the next thing we're going to talk about, and I'm hoping that the presentation didn't get skewed in this computer, is gap financing. What is a gap in financing, and what is an underwater development? Now, generally, these terms are talked about in a commercial or industrial real estate transaction. All right. So this is an underwater development. Essentially, it is where the cost of the improvement to improve the property exceeds the actual value of the property. And I think, and again, we're going to look at this from the context of a residential lens, which is not normally how it's looked at when we talk about underwater development. We're going to underwater development, underwater investment, however you want to look at it. So this is a case, we've got an abandoned, let's say we've got an abandoned property for 4 years. It's a residential single-family home, and it's valued at $50,000. That's the market value. Okay, but it's been vacant for 4 years. Not a person set foot in it. Water hasn't gone on. Heat hasn't gone on. There's going to be a substantial amount of improvements. Now, keep in mind, it's also from 1940. Okay, so already it's old. Already you've got issues, and it's only accelerated due to the time frame that's lapsed. So it's a $50,000 purchase, and it's also a $45,000 investment. You're talking new roof, furnace, and probably water heater and a few other elements, and you're already more than halfway there to $45,000. That's probably a very practical number. I see Dwayne Preston nodding his head, so I'm thinking he's agreeing with me. All right, so we're talking a $95,000 investment, but the property is only going to be valued at $75,000 at the end of the day. That's a very real scenario when you talk about these. And the realtors are nodding their heads on the back, so I know I must be hitting on something right. Ironically, $75,000 is your median value of single-family homes in the city of Batavia as of 2014. So that's a real number. Okay, so gap financing tools. I placed that in your mind. What is gap financing tools? So I'm not going to use, first of all, I want to talk about one word. We're going to talk about the word exemption. Now, exemption is like the dirty little word in New York State. Nobody likes to talk about exemptions. I know John doesn't like to talk about exemptions. So I'm not going to call them exemptions, I'm going to call them abatement, because that's a psychological change here. The point is there's gap financing tools we have on the books that the city has recognized, and the county has recognized, and the school district has recognized to help soften the blow of the growth of assessed value due to investment. Real quickly, these two have to do with commercial properties. The 485A is something you adopted in 2010. It basically takes a non-residential property, and when you convert it to a mixed-use property with residential and commercial, it abates, not exempts, abates the increase in assessed value actually for the first 8 years. It's a very robust, and it's very targeted because it's targeting non-residential properties going to mixed use. Cars Warehouse is the textbook picture of that. Perfect example, and it made that project happen. Now, the next one is the 485B. That's been on the books, I want to say, for 30 years, since 1978 or so. The business improvement exemption basically says, as you do an improvement to your commercial property, you can have the increased assessed value abated over the next 9 years on a limited portion. So it eases the increased assessed value, encourages it. The next two are residentially driven. The capital improvement residential building, the 421F, you adopted this in 2009, I think, or 2010, where it basically says if you do the same capital improvement to your home and your increased assessed value can be abated over a 9-year period, okay? So you won't realize it all at once. So let's say I do a 400 square foot addition onto my house, and it costs me $40,000, $40,000. The truth is my assessed value isn't going to go up $34,000. My assessed value probably goes up 10, 15 grand. I can have that increase in assessed value abated over a 9-year period, increasing 12.5% a year until I realize the full valuation. So it's nice, but it's not really, it doesn't really fill the gap financing issue. The historical property exemption is also very targeted. It's at properties that have a historical designation, or it's in the historic overlay district, which is downtown here. That, again, is very robust. I think the exemption is 100% for, the abatement is 100% for the first 5 or 6 years, but again, very targeted. Has to be a property that has a designation. So the problem with these is that nothing is specifically targeted at vacant and abandoned residential properties in a specific geographic area of the city. It does not target that, okay? So factors to consider. Let's do a little scenario here. Factors to consider. I will tell you, I've been working very closely with NICOM on some of this because they're very interested in this type of work. If we take the median household income of the city, which in 2012 was $38,000, and when people buy real estate, homeowners, they generally look at it from a different perspective of a commercial property. With a commercial property, you're probably looking at it as, all right, I can generate X amount of revenue over a period of time, which can pay for the property, and my investment might be 10 or 15 years in terms of financing. When people buy a residential property, they say, I make X amount of dollars, I can afford this amount of mortgage and tax payment on an annual basis, therefore, I can afford a house in this range. It's a little different scenario, so you have to change the mindset a little bit. In this case, 20% of the median income would be $7,600. Now, I picked 20% for a reason. If you read anything, You could say, well, you shouldn't exceed 30% of your income for housing. Truth be told is that usually doesn't consider other debt. It doesn't consider retirement planning. It doesn't consider anybody has kids college planning. It doesn't consider those types of things. So I picked 20% because that's probably more practical. That means I'm spending $7,600 on a mortgage, that's principal and interest, and taxes a year. What does that get me? It gets me a house of $75,000. That's what it gets me. Ironically, that's the median single-family home. There's probably a correlation between that number and that number, okay? And, by the way, that's a 30-year fixed mortgage at 4% and a tax rate of $44 per thousand, which is what your city, county, and school taxes are, okay? Everybody follow me so far? All right. Now, let's throw an abatement in there. Not an exemption, an abatement. Let's throw an abatement on the increased assessed value of that home after your improvement, okay? But I'm not going to put a length on it right now because I haven't defined it. So it's going to abate the increase in assessed value. Okay. One thing. Here's my $7,600 maximum. That's roughly the same thing right there. In this scenario, I'm paying $4,300 in mortgage, and I'm paying $3,300 in taxes. That gets me a $75,000 investment. If I abate the increased assessed value due to the improvement I make to that home, because remember, I have to spend $95,000, right? I pay $7,600 again, but I'm paying $5,400 in the mortgage and $2,200 in the taxes, which, by the way, that $2,200 is the same amount of money that you were receiving prior to the investment. But look at the difference. I'm investing $95,000 versus $75,000. Okay? That's how taxes impact investment. It's a little backwards from a residential perspective, but the point is every $1,000 you're paying in taxes, you're not paying in a mortgage. Okay? And what our intent here is to get the vacant and abandoned property reinvested and back, filling it with people again, because I'll talk about what that benefit is. So what's your real gain? Let's talk about that, right? Because everybody's got to carry their own bricks. Right, John? Everybody's got to carry their own bricks. When you first said that to me, I wondered what we were building. When you first said that to me, I didn't get it till after the time. So this is the scenario right here. $95,000 investment, market value of $75,000, but we want to abate this right here. We want to abate it. So the gain is that the property's redeveloped and we're getting $700 in water and sewer money again. That wasn't there before. The gain is we're no longer spending $200 on 5 code visits and 1 PD visit to the property. The gain is we're no longer paying $290 in fines and fees to clean it up. The gain is conservatively you're getting $10,000 of buying power back in the property. And the gain is, I don't know what that is, but I'm sure there's a benefit, right? The property is now fully occupied and maintained and hopefully invested in. So hopefully everybody's property values around it are maintained or go up. So what's the loss? Because we're all paying that. We're all paying for that abatement. So what is that costing us? It's costing you $230 in city taxes a year on an abatement of $25,000. So for $230 a year, you could get this back. Okay? That's the hypothetical of gap financing from a residential component. Now, I do not have an exemption that's on the books. There isn't one that's created there. So one of the things I've been talking to NICOM about is, well, let's create, the nice thing about this state is you can do home rule legislation. There is some home rule legislation that Livingston and Steuben County has adopted. It's called a 485N. But it doesn't quite target this in the length of period that you probably need it to. So for example, all those other prior exemptions are usually an 8 to a 12-year period. Generally, an average residential mortgage is at a minimum 20 years, generally. Most people nowadays with the interest rates are going 30 years. So there isn't an exemption that carries for that length of period. So the point is we don't have anything that would address this way. But NICOM is interested in maybe working with communities to maybe create home rule legislation that may be targeted enough for vacant and abandoned properties to address that issue. Getting vacant properties occupied is has a far greater gain than the loss of property tax revenue due to temporary exemption. And it's not really a loss, it's just a lack of gain because you're still staying at the same level you were prior to the investment. The problem is we need to get the banks to move the properties because there's a title owner, but for most of them, we don't know who it is or we can't get a hold of them and the banks just continue to pay the taxes. So that is your first thing that needs to happen before we can get to this. Is there any questions about gap in financing yet? It's a little cumbersome, and it's looking at it from a different approach than generally how it's looked at from a commercial perspective. Another thing we think we should start to do is take some initiatives at the state legislative level. And prior to this meeting, we invited the county legislators, the school board, because if we were to do an exemption home rule, we would want them to adopt it as well, because the city's tax rate is the lowest on the tax bill. And obviously you want to get the other 8 entities. But also, there are 2 laws that did not make it through committee and on the floor yet that have to be reintroduced in January. One, you supported through resolution, which was the Attorney General's law. And there had some teeth in that are important for us. And I think you want to support that again. The second is amendments to the RPAPL that might make it much more feasible to execute if we needed to. It doesn't mean that we would, but it means if we needed to, it might give us some more opportunity. The other thing that I talk about in here is I've been asked to attend again and will attend the NICOM legislative agenda meeting next 2 weeks from now, 3 weeks from now, where we would bring these issues forward and say, New York Conference of Mayors, we want you to focus on these issues because it's important to us. So the next steps moving forward, and here's a little bit of some actions with some timelines. And I think when we talk about this, we need to keep in mind, A, continue to do what we're doing with respect to code enforcement, roads, sidewalks, your Vibrant Batavia efforts. But you need to then also, I think, focus on some of these issues. Some of these are research intensive. Something like this, an RFP process, you want to create a process that's going to be easy to supervise, to monitor, but also is going to get a certain intended result. And developing that and the structure is going to be important. Some communities do it, so we're not alone. We don't have to recreate the wheel, but it takes time to develop. This Home Expo, I think, is something that's really needed. It's about bringing all the resources that are available to people into one location and having them easily be able to access them and developing the partnerships. Other things like home rule legislation, that is where NICOM, if the council feels appropriate, we can start working with NICOM to develop some home rule legislation that's going to make sense, that's going to have a targeted impact at what we're doing. I think the key, though, the first thing we have to do is right here. Deal with the banks. We have to figure out a way to address the banks, to get them at the table to say, listen, you got to move on the property, and how can we help you move that property? How can we help that solution come to grips? And I don't know all the answers to it right now because a lot of it has to do with research. Yes?
I don't see my flood insurance up there.
It's right there.
Where is it?
Right there.
Jason,
yes.
Wasn't there something to do with the state preventing the banks from foreclosing? Wasn't there like a window that they wanted them to hold off to keep people from being evicted and whatnot?
There was some legislation, yes. The other aspect I think that plays more of a role is that there's many times, depending on the circumstance, a series of liens that ties up the foreclosure process. I also think when you're dealing with large lenders that have thousands of mortgage bundled together, they don't necessarily, and what we've been able to receive, what the information we've been able to find out is they don't have a clue that they own these mortgages. So there are some lending institutions that are starting to develop programs for easier transfer, and I think what we just have to do is spend some time and resources in understanding where are those areas that we have to focus on and how do we get the lenders and the banks to the table to talk about how we move these properties in a different direction. Now, I will touch on 2 things that I think have come up. And it's in our discussion. I don't have it in this presentation. I'm sorry, yes.
You said when you attend the conference,
yes.
You're going to support the Sound law and amendments to the RPAPL, Article 19. It's these 2 amendments here, the applying to commercial property.
Yes.
And then, okay, and those requirements.
Because right now that doesn't apply to commercial properties. Okay. And while that isn't, in light of our recent discussion earlier, while it isn't a huge issue for us, more urban areas have blocks of this. So I think it's probably a tool that we wouldn't mind having access to. But it's definitely the cumbersome issue, the notice procedure, making it similar to the foreclosure process would be more beneficial to us. Yep. One thing that's come up in discussion is land banks, and what do land banks do? It's very similar to what some communities have talked about with creating an LDC or a local development corporation. And the land bank in this state was created, I think, 2 or 3 years ago. They allowed for 10 land banks, and you have to apply to the one of the state agencies to get authority to have a land bank. And generally, this is focused around much more urban areas that have a more significant problem compared to what we have. The concern and the problem we've had at land banks in the state is that they're not funded. So land banks have the ability to purchase tax liens, purchase delinquent properties, to get transfer of properties so communities could transfer them to them, and they have the ability to redevelop them. The problem is they don't have any funding to do anything right now. So the funding is just starting to trickle down. And for us, if we wanted to apply for a land bank, you would lose some control over it. It would go to the land bank, which would then determine what happens. And most likely for us, if we were to participate, it would be part of something out of Monroe County or Erie County. So I don't know if a land bank is necessarily a solution for us right now. Plus, we don't have a lot of properties that go with it. But that did come up, I think, in talking with a few of you, you'd asked some questions about land banks, so I thought I'd address it. But, so I guess at that point, that's really the gist of it. I think, this gives us a good timeline with some objectives. This is going to take more focus and more energy and more resources to focus on. But I think with some good wins and some momentum on a few of these action items, we'll be able to see some success. Developing the inventory is going to be important because then we're going to be able to monitor what type of success are we having. Are our actions showing any positive results? But it is no one solution, as you can see. This is a very, very complex issue. One thing we're not talking about this is, how do you get that median income number up? That comes back to economic development and job growth. Improving wealth in the community is going to change that median house value. It's going to go up. That might improve the situation where people are more willing to put money into their properties. So, there's an economic development arm to this that comes into play. So that's it. I think really from today, what I'm looking for is there interest, and discussion, at least have discussion about these issues here. Do we want to move forward on some legislative advocacy, so to speak, and pursuing this type of development? Is there something that you want me to bring back in a few months to talk about? Is there interest for home rule legislation there? The rest of these, I think, are pretty self-explanatory, and I think are pretty, things that we can start initiating if we haven't already started already. So.
Everybody in agreement with that?
Yes, I am.
Any questions? Any other questions for Jason?
All right. Thank you very much.
Thank you.